Hi, my name is Gina Ligon.
And I'm Pete Seamy.
And we're here today to talk about branding destruction. So our topics for today is we're going to discuss the concept of a BEO as an organization. And then we'll describe the tenets of consumer brand relationships theory as it relates to violent ideological groups. Next, we'll demonstrate how these constructs work in a sample of violent ideological organizations that I've studied. And then we'll conclude by sharing some of Pete's research with the White Power movement and specifically how they use music and merchandise for marketing and branding their organization. So to get started, ideological organizations, in my opinion, are very similar to conventional organizations, except that they're belief-based. They have lots of variability in how they're structured and how complex they are, and they also have some performance goals. Now, the difference between ideological organizations and more conventional for-profit organizations that we study in management is that ideological organizations have goals that aren't purely fiscal. Instead, they have goals of sharing their ideology. They also have goals of recruiting new members, and of course they have goals to raise funds in order to support those first two objectives. Now, there have been several researchers who've also studied ideological organizations. For example, Athal and Riefmeyer found that ideological organizations that are older and larger are usually capable of leveraging more lethality. In addition, Lindsay Hagel found that hierarchically structured ideological organizations are more long-term and sustainable and also more lethal. And so my role as an IO psychologist is to understand how these organizational strategies and structures translate into other indices of performance like fundraising and recruiting that would then eventually play out in terms of lethality. And so one promising theoretical framework that I've used is one of consumer brand relationship theory. So if you look at slide 4, you'll see what we know about consumer brand relationship theory in the more conventional management and marketing literatures. And so what consumer brand relationship theory is really about is that organizations create this brand that consumers have a relationship with, meaning that they want that brand to become part of their identity. And how does that happen? Well, a lot of marketers have studied this, and they found that some organizations are better at sort of branding and marketing themselves in a way that consumers want to identify with that brand. They want to have a very strong and lasting relationship with that brand. And most of the research in this area is that on reputation. And so brands that have stronger reputations when compared to other brands in the marketplace are better at leveraging sort of that long-term relationship with the actual consumer. And so there are two indices of reputation that we look at with conventional marketing theories, one of which is perceived quality, and that's the brand or the organization's capacity to deliver on developing the goods it says it's supposed to. So if you are the organization in a violent setting who says that you can achieve your objectives for your members better than other groups, then you would be shown to have higher perceived quality. Another index of firm reputation is that of prominence, and this is sort of your reputation as it's compared to other organizations. Prominence is really in the minds of the stakeholders, and it's often influenced by how they're perceived by third parties. And so one way that we look at prominence in the conventional literature is to look at like Fortune magazine's most admired companies. When companies get placed on that list and are shown as sort of prominent when compared to other organizations in their target markets, they are perceived to have a higher reputation by their stakeholders. And one translator of firm reputation is what we found is media portrayals and how that firm is actually described and how often it's talked about in the media. And so Deep House has done quite a bit of research on what are some of the characteristics of firms that have these higher perceived reputations in terms of their brand. And what they found is that firms that have a brand that appears to be rare, non-conformist, non-imitainable, and there's no substitutes for it, actually have higher perceived quality and higher prominence than other organizations with similar types of strategies. Deep House has also done some great work looking at how strategies to increase firm reputation have translated into these media portrayals, and then how that's translated into return on assets. And so what we did is we wanted to apply the same theoretical framework to that of violent ideological organizations. And so we had a sample of 45 violent ideological organizations, both in Western and non-Western regions, with all different types of ideologies that we applied some of these constructs to. So if you look at slide 5, you can see our overall model of how violent extremist organizations have used this sort of branding framework to market themselves. So first in the model that we measured in our sample is we looked at their organizational structure and strategies. So some of those strategies we looked at were things like malevolent innovation. So some organizations have more unique, surprising, original, unusually cruel attacks, and they're better at getting media attention for those attacks. So we looked at that as one possible antecedent to firm reputation or notoriety in the case of violent groups. We also looked at things like promotional efforts. Pete will talk much more about this in his segment when he talks about music and merchandise. And then finally, mission and what the organization's overarching ideology was. Because if you translate some of the work that Deep House and Rendova had done on non-substitutability, organizations that have that supernatural mission or a mission ordained by a higher power seem like they would fit that model, that they are non-substitutable because this higher being has been the one that sort of sanctioned their existence. And so when organizations engage in those types of structures and strategies, that leads to greater notoriety. And again, we measured notoriety based on the two main constructs that it's used in conventional marketing theory, but we used objective markers that were situated in violent groups. So for prominence, we looked at co-branding, so we looked at the amount of other types of violent groups who've endorsed these groups or come out and praised them publicly. External legitimacy, we looked at how these organizations were viewed in terms of being a powerful organization. So, for example, if they were placed on the foreign terrorist organization list by the U.S. or one of our other 5 allies. And then finally, we looked at brand relationship quality, or BRQ. And here we just did a straight count of amount of media hits that they received after one of these organizational strategies were put into place. So after a particular unusually cruel attack, we looked at the media hits, the number of references to them in the popular media, both in their domain as well as the U.S. And then we also looked at the tenor of those reports, both positive and negative. And so what's different about VEOs is that even negative attention eventually translated into greater performance, which we'll talk about with our example. And so finally, we measured some indices of performance like recruitment and fundraising, and if they were able to accomplish their ideological objectives. So a great exemplar case study I'll leave you with that fits this model nicely, and we were able to find strong statistically significant paths between each of these different types of variables or characteristics, organizational structure and strategies leading to notoriety, and then leading to overarching performance of that violent group. A great example of that is Jemaah Islamiyah. And so JI was actually founded in 1993, and they executed a particularly cruel and unusual attack on Christmas Eve of 2000. So that would fit into the organizational strategy of an unusually cruel and highly publicized attack. That resulted in greater reputation for them with their potential recruits and funding sources. They got a third-party endorsement from Al-Qaeda, who came in and mentioned that they had praised the work that they did on those Christmas Eve bombings. They also were eventually placed on the foreign terrorist organization list by the United States after that, and their media hits went up 1,200% from the 6 months prior to that attack to the 6 months post that attack. What we found then is that increased their capacity for fundraising and recruiting. They had greater access to training facilities and deeper level diversity of members. And then, as you know, in 2002, they leveraged even greater, a more lethal attack in 2002 with the Bali nightclub bombings. So you see that their particular organizational trajectory and marketing strategies fit this model very well, because they had this organizational strategy of being unusual and cruel, non-imitatable, that led to greater reputation or notoriety in their domain, which then increased their fundraising and their recruiting sources, which then translated into that lethality. So in conclusion, we know that VEOs are using organizational strategy in these promotional efforts, whether they be in products or unusual attacks, much the same way we know that conventional organizations use them to gain notoriety and increase their reputation of their firm. And that is translating into greater performance by these organizations in terms of fundraising and recruiting, which then may also translate into lethality down the road. Next, I'll turn to Pete Simi, who will share his work with the White Power movement and how this marketing theory might apply to them as well.